Larry, I thought, brought up a great point of why Kyle isn't willing to take that risk with Lance. And I think we have to go on a little bit of a history lesson here and talk about what happened to his dad in Denver. And I tweeted this out, a few days ago, just to have it on record mostly. I know the two of you established earlier in the show that you don't use Twitter, so I'll rehash it for you. So his dad's last 4 years in Denver are very important to me. Now, let's remember, before his dad's last 4 years in Denver, he had built an equity where, he had, 7 years in Denver. He had already been there at that point. No, he had been there for 8 years at that point. And, he had won 2 Super Bowls. Fantastic, right? 2 Super Bowls, great record. He goes 13-3 in 2005 with Jake Plummer under center. That year, they beat New England in the divisional round. I think they blew him out. They beat him like 27-10. That was the year Belichick came into the locker room after and talked to Shanahan about his run game because they killed him in that playoff game, Brady and Belichick. And then they ended up losing to the Steelers team that beat Seattle in the Super Bowl with the Hines Ward from Antoine Randall, Willie Parker, 75-yard touchdown run. Big Ben not scoring a touchdown to this day, nobody cares about, but the ball never crossed the plane. Only his head did. It matters. It does matter, people. It still matters to me. I'm sorry, but that was not a touchdown. So they lost in that Super Bowl, right? The subsequent year, his dad makes the bold move to trade up for a quarterback. Now, I've read some articles later that apparently his dad wanted Matt Leinart with the pick, and there was the president or somebody who wanted Jay Cutler. And when Matt Leinart went 10, his dad was pissed, but they still traded up because somebody else wanted Jay Cutler within the organization. Either way, Mike Shanahan was in charge of everything in Denver at that point. So let's attribute Jay Cutler completely to him, and let's say that he drafted Jay Cutler. The next year, they were 7-4 with Jake Plummer playing middle. At that point, Shanahan benches Jake Plummer, plays rookie Jay Cutler. They finished the season, I want to say, let me give you the exact how they finished the season. They finished the season, by the way, they traded a 1 and a 3 for Cutler, just for reference, 1 and a 3 for Cutler. They finished the season 9-7 and didn't make the playoffs. So remember, they were 7-4 with Jake Plummer. They went 2-3 with Jay Cutler, and they didn't make the playoffs. By the way, from a pure statistical standpoint, Cutler completely outperformed Plummer in every single metric. So I want to include that for the sake of argument. You could make the argument that he made the completely right decision. Now, the very next year, right? So he's made an NFC championship game, and now he's barely missed the playoffs. The very next year, they go all the way with Cutler, right? They commit to the plan. They commit to the plan of developing Cutler. They go 7-9. Cutler has somewhat of an up and down year, but okay, this is what happens when you're developing a quarterback, right? Then finally, in 2008, the year Shanahan gets fired, they start 8-5. They finish the season 8-8, and they miss the playoffs. Shanahan gets fired. Now, the interesting thing about this season is Cutler actually gets developed in this season. He makes the Pro Bowl. He throws for 4,500 yards, which was third in the NFL at the time. 4,500 yards in 2000, and I think that was 8 is a lot of yards. I think only Breeze had thrown for, it was before Manning, Breeze, and Brady all started throwing for 5,000, Stafford, all of that. It was only Breeze at the time that had reached that mark. So 4,500 yards, a very impressive number. Cutler is a Pro Bowler, and guess what happens? He gets a new coach, a young offensive genius in Josh McDaniels, who trades him, and Mike Shanahan, the coach that won 2 Super Bowls in Denver, the guy who just developed Jay Cutler, what happened to him? He got fired. And to me, where this comes full circle is Kyle goes on the Flying Coach podcast with Sean McVay and Peter Schrager in 2021. When he goes on that podcast, they get into a long topic, which was news to us at the time. That was fresh news, that Shanahan originally did not want the 49ers job. He didn't want the 49ers job because they were 32nd in defense, 32nd in offense at the time, right? They had both of those two issues, and they didn't have a quarterback. And there's a quote, and I direct quoted it from Kyle on that podcast. And he says, and he references dad's career. This is why this is important to me. He says, my goal was to become a head coach and stay a head coach. I didn't write it in, but what he says right after that is, I didn't want to just become a head coach and get there. I wanted to become a head coach and stay a head coach. And his point was, he had learned from watching his dad's career that the only way to stay a head coach in the NFL is if you have a great quarterback, because then you can go through the ups and downs and you can survive a 7-9 season. You can survive an 8-8 season. His dad, even with 2 Super Bowls on his resume, could not survive the back-to-back 7-9 and 8-8 season. By the way, Thomas says Marino threw for 5K. I know Marino threw for 5K in 84. I'm referencing when the new age quarterbacks started crossing that barrier over and over again. In 2011, I think Stafford, Brady, Breeze threw for 5,000. I think Manning in 2013 threw for 5,000. So there's been Mahomes threw for 5,018. So that threshold has been crossed like 8 times over since then. So, but his dad got fired right after the 2 Super Bowls. Going back to this, his dad got fired, and so the kind of the where this all climaxes to me is, remember, Kyle said last year that they considered replacing Garoppolo with Lance after the Arizona game going into the Indianapolis game. What happened to Trey Lance was he had an MCL strain. Then the Niners ultimately dropped to 3-5, and what happened? Who came to practice out of nowhere? It was a big deal. Kyle Juszczyk said he noticed it. John York came to practice. Now, when John York comes to practice, Jesse, and Larry, my interpretation of that situation is, hey, Kyle, who's had 3 out of 4 losing seasons, he's 3-5 right now. We are trending towards another losing season. John York is there to put some pressure and light some urgency under the asses of Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch. And at that point, what did he do? He didn't do what his dad did, which was bench Jake Plummer and let's start developing the quarterback and see where it goes. He went right back to the veteran. And to me, part of his reluctancy to go with Trey Lance is, and this sounds crazy because I think a lot of us think Kyle Shanahan has 100% job security. But I think at the time, if he had started with Lance in 2021 and he had a losing season with Lance in 21 and he had a losing season with Lance in 22 or something like that, something like what happened to his dad with Jay Cutler, I think Lance would have gotten a new coach before Shanahan would have gotten a new quarterback. And now in this case, by working it out, Shanahan has gotten a new quarterback before Lance has gotten a new coach. That is deep conspiracy theory for you guys. Past midnight, Jesse's enjoying July 7th out in the East Coast. Me and Larry are still enjoying July 6th. But that is deep historical parallels. And when he says, I saw what happened to my dad's career, and I heard that, and I remember he said that on the podcast, that was the ultimate warning sign to me that he saw his dad develop a quarterback, turn him into a Pro Bowl, and get fired for doing it because he didn't win enough games. And he wasn't going to sacrifice going through losing seasons developing a quarterback because that could end in him losing his job.
I'm going to poke a hole in that just real quick.
Oh, man, come on, man. I just went on for like 7 minutes and you're going to poke a hole?
Not necessarily in your theory, because I don't necessarily believe that you're wrong in that thinking. But Kyle Shanahan shot himself in the foot at the State of the Union this year because they asked him. And in fact, they didn't ask him. They were asking John Lynch a question. I forget how exactly it went, but they were talking to John Lynch and Jed York. And I think Jed York had said something, and then Kyle goes, hold on, and butts in and says, I just want to make it clear that even though, it could seem like from the outside that there's a lot of pressure and all these other things, I've always felt like not only are we on the same page, but there was never that pressure to go out and perform. I always felt like I had everything I needed to make the decision that I wanted in the moment, and I always felt like I had the backing no matter what. So he offered that up without a question being asked to him. So regardless of what actually may have happened, or even if that theory is right, he took that theory and threw it right in the garbage. And now I basically what I'm saying is he doesn't deserve to be given this long leash and say, hey, it's all good that you just, potentially passed up on Trey Lance and didn't develop him and do all those things, because he himself said he never felt any pressure.
Larry?
Well, I mean,
Great point.
We can twist and turn and, look at it a bunch of different ways. The reality is we would all agree on one thing. The team that he inherited was not very good.
Agree.
And they won 10 games combined in his first 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
And they lost 22. So it wasn't, they're 10-22 2 years in. And then since that point, they've been to 3 of the last 4 NFC Championship games. 13 wins, 10 wins, 13 wins. In between, there was the 6-10 season in 2020 where they had record number of injuries. And it's, they unfortunately, Trey Lance came along, at a point when, they drafted Trey Lance at a point where they really needed to start to win. You don't get forever in the NFL. So you got a couple passes in the first couple years. Then you get to a Super Bowl in year 3. I think everybody would admit in 2019, the Niners were ahead of schedule. But now they're not. Now they've been to the last 2 NFC championship games. Right. Now there's some pressure. And so they enter 2023 with, I'm sure, Dr. John and Jed going, hey, we like what we've seen in comparison to the coaches that preceded you, but it's time for us to win a Super Bowl. Right. I mean, this is the San Francisco 49ers. We judge ourselves by Super Bowl wins. So I think there is some pressure. And that's what I've been saying this entire offseason, that I think Brock is their best option, but it's really more about they feel urgency to not just win a division or make it to the playoffs. They've done that. And they don't even, I don't even think this year would be a successful year if they made it to the NFC Championship game. They have to make it to the Super Bowl, and deep down, they got to win it. And so they're just going with Brock, I think, now because they feel like Brock gives them the best opportunity. And as far as Trey and his development, I think they're so they're clearly not going to clear a path for him. Do they want him to develop? Yeah. They don't want to give him away because they kind of fear that he'll be really good on the back end. And they're going with Brock because it's time to win, and they're feeling some urgency. I don't think it's totally, I don't think it's totally an accurate statement to say that there's no pressure. It's the NFL. There's always some pressure. And then you're the head coach of the 49ers. Right. They judge themselves with Super Bowls. So there is real pressure here. But he just doesn't want to speak it into existence. Right. So because there's no advantage in doing that. So he's just going with his most polished quarterback that he thinks he can win with now. And they're just kind of kicking the Trey Lance can down the road and seeing where he is. And I'm not sure if they know how much he'll develop or won't develop. And they don't want to trade off of him because they fear that what they liked about him will come to fruition somewhere else. So I think that's kind of where they're at. And then as far as these other guys, I think the other guys are here because of the scar tissue of watching Josh Johnson for 3 quarters. I think that's why Darnold's here. I think that's why Allen's here. It's just because, oh my God, that can't happen again. And that's how I see it. I think all the Darnold talk, starting talk, is probably bogus. I just think it's just, we're not handing Trey anything. Anything he gets, he will earn. And Brock's the guy they're going with. That's how I'd sum this thing up. Brock's the guy they're going with because he fits the urgency to win now. And he's the guy who's most ready to win now. They would move off of Trey if they had a real conviction that he wasn't the guy, but they don't. They would probably make him the unquestioned number 2 if they had a real conviction that he was the guy, but they don't. And the other guys are there just for insurance. That's how I see it.